heroic programmer of the first 3 Final Fantasy games, says he'd never seen any role-playing games until Final Fantasy. Nasir Jebeli was an Iranian-American programmer who traveled to Japan on a work visa to work for Square in the late 80s and early 90s, where he was instrumental in the creation of the Final Fantasy series. Jebeli's code is so well regarded that John Romero called him my #1 programming god, my idol, in honoring the code. Conversations with Great Game Designers. He's the one responsible for Final Fantasy III's airship, which hoons along above the overworld map so fast that other programmers weren't able to recreate it. Following his work on Secret of Mana, Jebeli retired, making rare public appearances like the time he was interviewed by Romero at an Apple II reunion in 1998. However, he recently spoke to NHK World, as spotted by Games Radar, and talked about his time at Square. Prior to that, Jebeli had worked mainly on action games for the Apple II, like the 1981 Defender clone Gorgon. Going from that to the NES wasn't as much of a leap as you might think. Japanese national TV managed to track down and do a rare interview with Nasir Jebeli, the genius Iranian-American programmer that programmed the first Final Fantasy game. #Final Fantasy. He led the programming for the first 3 Final Fantasy games. What a legend! pic.twitter.com/gngk. January 11, 2025. I thought it was pretty similar to what I was doing for Apple. Jebeli said, the same processor, and I already knew just about every machine code for that processor. Both ran on the MOS Technology 6502, the workhorse behind many home computers and consoles of the 80s. So as far as coding, it was pretty simple. There was no learning curve. But I'd never seen any role-playing games until Final Fantasy was brought up. In the 1980s, games like Ultima and Wizardry were a lot more niche than RPGs are today, though Dragon Quest had been a big enough hit in Japan that Hironobu Sakaguchi could convince Square to let him lead development on the game that became Final Fantasy. A lack of experience with the genre probably wasn't that much of a hindrance, since they were helping to lay its foundations. It was a challenge, Jebeli said, but at the same time it was exciting to be able to do something different. And it was also fun to work with the team, especially Sakaguchi-san. At the end of the interview, Jebeli sits down at a TV to play Final Fantasy. The airship races along. He looks at it thoughtfully, then suggests it could look better if it was at least like 10% slower. You can watch more footage from the documentary, which is called Legendary Games Chronicle, Final Fantasy, in English at NHK World's website.